Okay, so I want to get into this question of is time travel possible? And this is a neat sort of question to think about. It also has some bearing on the free will question. And it has some bearing on the free will question because remember I said, well, there's this question: does the future exist in the same way that the past and present do? Or are they essentially different from each other? Does the future not exist or exist in a different kind of way than the present and the past? And this actually has a lot of bearing on time travel, or time travel has a lot of bearing on it. You know, so remember, Taylor thinks that the present, the past, and the future are all basically the same. It's just that we know one better than the other. We know the present and the past better than we know the future. Future's just as much set, exists in exactly the same ways that the past and present do. And, because of that, the idea that we can change the future is an illusion. And now, a way of thinking of this is that different times in Taylor's view are really just like different places, right? Right now, I'm in 2021 and I'm in Norfolk. I'm not in 2035 or in Tokyo, right? But in Taylor's view, Tokyo exists even though I'm not in Norfolk. Well, that's obvious, right? I mean, I'm not going to doubt that Tokyo exists, right? I could get on a plane and go to Tokyo. I mean, I've always wanted to, right? It's I don't know. I've always wanted to go to Japan. Maybe one of these days I actually will, right? In Taylor's view, though, 2035 exists in the same way that Tokyo does, right? I'm not there now. Hopefully, I will be there eventually, right? I'm not there now, but it's there, right? So, if this is true, and you'll hear people talk about this a lot, that time is in some way analogous to space, right? And think of the analogy here, right? This was, I talked about theological issues. One of the views that people often naturally came to is to say, well, look, our view of time is like somebody who's stuck at the very ground level. He can only see what's all around him. God is like somebody at the top of a skyscraper with a telescope. He can see miles and miles and miles around, right? Anyway, time and space are then the same. It's just we can't travel as freely through time as we do space on a view like Taylor's. But if the future and past are not essentially different, obviously traveling through time is difficult. It might even be contrary to the law of science. We'll talk about more about that in a second. But there's no in principle reason, if the past and present and the future are all alike, that one couldn't travel from the future to the past. Or from the present to the past, right? I mean, obviously, it's always possible to travel to the future. The old joke about the kid who has the time machine. His brother gets in. He waits a minute. Brother gets out. He's like, wait. He's like, oh, yeah, you've traveled a minute in the future. Congratulations, right? Um, Obviously, it's always possible to travel into the future. The question is just, can you go the other way, right? We are all currently traveling into the future. Now, remember, I said the other view is that the future is different, that it doesn't exist in the way that the past and present do. If that's true, if the future is different from the past, and the way it's different is it doesn't exist in the way the past does, or doesn't even exist at all yet, then it doesn't seem anyone could travel from the future, right? Future people and things don't yet exist. If you don't exist, you can't do anything, right? So, if the future is just like the past, then at least in principle, it seems like it should be possible to travel from the future to the present or the future to the past, right? If the future is different, especially if it's different in the sense that it doesn't yet exist, then time travel shouldn't be possible. All right. If past is completely set unlike future, that gives us reason to think we cannot travel into the past either, right? Well, you know, you can't change things because the past is set. This idea that one is set and the other one isn't, some people will think explains the very idea of why time flows one way and not the other. So hopefully all this sort of preparation gives you guys some idea why, we're going into this from this stuff on free will. The question of whether time travel is possible, I think, might tell us something about whether the future is really different from other times or not. And I think we're going to see that if time travel is possible, some weird stuff will be true. Does that give us reason to think that it isn't? And if it isn't, does it give us reason to think that the future is different than the past or the present? That's all a little unclear, but I think these are interesting issues to walk through. And I think maybe this will throw a bit more light on these questions of whether the future is set or not. Okay, so the last thing I want to say in this sort of preparatory lecture is to talk about different senses of possibility, right? I've been throwing back and forth these words about possibility. Is time travel possible? Is it not? And there are different things we might mean by possibility. One thing we might mean by possibility is physical possibility. The laws and facts of nature don't rule it out. That's what physical possibility means. That's not our question, right? That's one for the scientists. I, as a philosopher, am not going to trample over what, physicists do. I don't have the expertise. But I do think philosophers can ask a different, maybe deeper question, which is whether time travel is logically or metaphysically possible. Now, let me say a little bit more about these different senses of possibility. This is a complicated issue. I'm not going to get super deeply into it, but I do think it's worth saying a little bit more about these. Here are some examples of physical impossibility. It is impossible to fly to London from New York City in an hour or less. If someone told you they did that, you would know they're lying because there's no plane that can do that, right? At some point in the future, we might have a rocket ship that can do that, but right now, it is not possible to fly to London from New York City in an hour or less. Another sense of impossibility, it is impossible to change lead to gold through chemical processes. All these alchemists tried for years to do this. It turns out, we find out that given what we know about atoms and their structure, you cannot change lead to gold through chemistry. You might be able to do it with a particle accelerator, but there's no chemical process, that you can do lead to gold. That is impossible. Finally, it is impossible to go faster than the speed of light, right? Physicists tell us that you cannot go faster than the speed of light. These are all questions of physical impossibility. Now, there might be different senses of physical impossibility. Maybe we'll invent a plane one day that can go this fast. That seems to be different than lead to gold or faster than light. But all of these go with the laws of nature, right? You can at least coherently imagine turning lead to gold. Turns out you can't actually do it, but there's nothing contradictory about the thought. You can at least imagine going faster than the speed of light, right? All these science fiction shows, people do it. Logical impossibility is something different. In a very real sense, with logical impossibility, you can't even coherently imagine it. So, it is impossible for a triangle to have 4 sides. You can't imagine a 4-sided triangle because anything you imagine with 4 sides is not a triangle, right? It is impossible for a bachelor to be unmarried, right? Bachelor is by definition an unmarried man. Anybody who is married is not a bachelor. Now, logical impossibility, physical impossibility, 2 very clearly different kinds of possibility. Metaphysical impossibility, people will argue about whether this is even a thing or not. It's harder to define, but the thought is it's something deeper than physical possibility, but not quite as deep as logical possibility or impossibility. I'm going to treat metaphysical impossibility and possibility and logical possibility and possibility as the same thing, even though I'm sure if some philosophers out there listen to this, they're going to pull their hair out and be mad at me. It's just very hard to define what metaphysical impossibility is. One example might be mathematical statements. 5 times 5 equals 19 is impossible. I say might be because there's a lot of arguments about whether mathematical statements are just statements about logic or not, whether there's something more on top of that. That gets super duper complicated. I won't go into it. So all you guys really need to know, distinguish physical impossibility from logical. Know that there might be this other kind of possibility, metaphysical possibility, that it's not the same as physical. You don't need to be able to neatly sort it out, metaphysical from logical or metaphysical from physical, because philosophers themselves tie themselves in knots on this. Okay, so I know that's not completely razor sharp. There's no neat dividing line I've given you guys, but I hope you have at least some sense of how logical possibility differs from physical possibility, and how it's going to be logical possibility we're mainly concerned about. Is time travel logically possible or not? The laws of nature, I don't know what they say about time travel. Physicists themselves argue about it, but what does logical possibility say about it? And one thing to keep in mind here, logical possibility is deeper than physical possibility because anything that's logically impossible can't be physically possible, right? People never ask themselves, is it possible to have a 4-sided triangle? You don't need to go out and do anything to find out anything about nature to know you can't do that. People did ask themselves and wondered for a long time, can we turn lead to gold? So if we find out that time travel is logically impossible, we don't need to then ask whether it's physically possible, right? Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense to you guys. We'll move into the next lecture and talk about some of the paradoxes of time travel. Time travel does seem to threaten to generate logical contradictions. Remember, paradox is either a contradiction or a very weird result. It threatens to generate contradictions. It almost certainly, if we think about time travel, generates paradoxes in the sense of some very weird results.